What
would
Washington
say?
I don't know.
In this segment from the Maxims of Washington, we'll be reading from the section False and Cruel Policy of Great Britain. This will be broken up into 3 different sections because we'll be covering most of the content from this writing. In the first section, Lord Camden, the Lord High Chancellor of Great Britain during the American Revolution, was hoping for an American rebellion so that Britain could ultimately come out on top. Britain did not think the Americans could effectively fight against British forces and welcomed a rebellion because afterwards Britain would be justified in instituting greater restrictions and taxes on the colonies in the name of keeping order. George Washington describes the ultimate goal of stoking an American rebellion was for Britain to gain more control over Americans by removing their rights as citizens and taking away weapons. Quote, Great Britain understood herself perfectly well in this dispute, but did not comprehend America. She meant, as Lord Camden clearly and explicitly declared, to drive America into rebellion that her own purposes might be more fully answered by it. End quote. In this next section, it talks about how after 3 years of fighting, Washington shares that British officials who dismissed America's terms as morally unjust and unreasonable before the war started, now were revisiting those terms and declaring them reasonable and just. Washington was outraged by British officials who were so obviously not using moral reasoning skills before stoking war with America, especially after the tragedies that millions of people endured. Quote, They meant to drive us into what they termed rebellion, that they might be furnished with a pretext to disarm, and then strip us of the rights and privileges of Englishmen and citizens. If they were actuated by the principles of justice, why did they refuse indignantly to accede to the terms which were humbly supplicated before hostilities commenced, and this country was deluged in blood, and now make their principal officers and even the commissioners themselves say that these terms are just and reasonable? Nay, that more will be granted than we have yet asked, if we will relinquish our claim to independency. What name does such conduct as this deserve, and what punishment is there in store for the men who have distressed millions, involved thousands in ruin, and plunged numberless families in inextricable woe? Could that which is just and reasonable now have been unjust 4 years ago? End quote. In this final section, Washington describes how Great Britain, having failed to easily defeat the Americans with arms, began to resort to dishonorable tactics. They forged letters by George Washington pretending to have intercepted them, and then advertised to people the false impression that Washington was driving the conflict unnecessarily onward. Great Britain tried to give everyone the impression that they were suing for peace with America, but that Americans, especially George Washington, would never accept peaceful terms no matter how favorable they were. This tactic was meant to create dissension in American Congress and try to convince them to give up their independence. Quote, They must be either wantonly wicked and cruel, or, which is only another mode of describing the same thing, under false colors are now endeavoring to deceive the great body of the people by industriously propagating a belief that Great Britain is willing to offer any terms and that we will accept none, thereby hoping to poison and disaffect the minds of those who wish for peace and to create feuds and dissensions among ourselves. In a word, having less dependence now in their arms than their arts, they are practicing such low and dirty tricks that men of sentiment and honor must blush at their fall. Among other maneuvers in this way, they are forging letters and publishing them as intercepted ones of mine, to prove that I am an enemy to the present measures, and have been led into them step by step, still hoping that Congress would recede from their claims. End quote.